First thing you're going to need is safety goggles to protect your eyes from accidental splashes and from fumes stinging your eyes. Next, you're going to need something to solder, and in this video, we'll be using a flexible copper wire to solder onto an LCD. We'll also be using a desolder wick that allows us to remove any solder if we make a mistake. Next, we'll be using what we call a solder, which allows us to melt and connect electrical parts together. Solder comes in either a roll or in a small canister as shown here. There are different types of solder such as lead and lead-free rosin core solder. Just make sure you're in a well-ventilated area, especially when using a lead solder. Now for the main part, we'll need a soldering iron which will help us melt the solder. There are different soldering tips that come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, and each tip is used for specific purposes. Here we have the two most common soldering tips. First is the chisel tip, which is helpful for soldering wires or other large components. This one is called a conical tip, which is used more for precision for smaller components. For this video, we'll be using the chisel tip. Next is the brass cleaner, which will help keep our soldering iron tip clean. You can also use a conventional sponge. It's important to keep the soldering iron clean because oxidation forms on the tip that turns black and prevents the tip from accepting the solder. Lastly, we'll be using what's called a helping hand. It's not exactly necessary, but it does tremendously help us hold our electronic parts as we solder. First, you want to turn on your soldering iron and wait till it heats up to around 400 degrees Celsius. Next, take your chisel tip and warm up your electronic components, and be careful to not burn your wires while doing so. Now, make sure you tin your tip by applying a small amount of solder on your solder tip. This process helps improve the heat transfer from the iron tip to your electronic components. Now it's time to place your solder on your electronic component and continue to heat up your electronic component using the soldering tip. As you can see here, the tip is not directly touching the solder. The heat from the soldering tip to the electronic component is enough to melt the solder, so there is no need to directly touch the solder tip to your solder. Make sure you clean your solder tip every so often. You can add more solder if you'd like, if your wires aren't fully covered by the solder. Lastly, give your wires a gentle tug just to make sure it is properly connected and won't come apart. Now we're going to solder an LCD screen. We follow the same steps as earlier. Wait till the solder tip is hot, warm up the electronic component, in this case the LCD screen, tin the solder tip, and finally, place both the solder tip and solder onto the electronic component. At the bottom of the screen shows us what to look for in the good solder. Make any necessary adjustments to get that perfect volcano shape. Now if you mess up or the solder is not good enough, place the desolder wick on top of the bad solder and heat it up with the solder tip. Now, the bad solder will stick to the desolder wick. And that's the basics of soldering. Remember to always put your safety first. Wear appropriate eye protection, be in a well-ventilated area, and be careful of the extremely hot solder tip and electronic components. We hope that this video helped you get started on soldering.